In early 1968, while the U.S. command still believed that its overwhelming firepower could wear down the enemy's main force units, the Khe Sanh area in western Quang Tri province became a major concentration point for both sides. Located less than 20 kilometers from the Vietnam-Laos border, the Khe Sanh combat base controlled part of Route 9 and overlooked the routes leading from Laos into the central coastal region of South Vietnam. For the U.S. command, holding Khe Sanh was not only intended to protect the western flank of the defensive network along the demilitarized zone, but also to prevent the People's Army of Vietnam from expanding its operations into the Quang Tri lowlands. General William C. Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, believed that the enemy was preparing to launch a large-scale battle in the area. Rather than abandoning the base, he decided to hold Khe Sanh and turn it into a focal point for artillery, tactical air power, and B-52 strategic bombers. If People's Army of Vietnam units concentrated in sufficient numbers around the base, U.S. firepower would be used to inflict heavy losses on them on an isolated battlefield far from populated areas. On the opposing side, units of the 304th Division, the 325 C Division, along with numerous artillery, air defense, and engineer units, gradually moved into the Khe Sanh area. Actual troop strength varied throughout different stages of the campaign, but U.S. intelligence estimated that more than 20,000 troops had been deployed around the base. Facing them were approximately 6,000 U.S. and Republic of Vietnam personnel centered on the 26th Marine Regiment under the command of Colonel David E. Lowndes. The defenders not only held the main combat base but also occupied hills 881 South, 861, 861A, 558, and 950, forming a defensive ring that dominated the key avenues of approach. By mid-January 1968, after both sides had completed most of their preparations, the first clashes around the high ground north of Khe Sanh began to signal the largest siege the United States Marine Corps would face during the entire Vietnam War. On the 20th of January 1968, Company 1 of the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marine Regiment departed its position on Hill 881 South to conduct a reconnaissance patrol toward Hill 881 North. The unit was commanded by Captain William Dabney. 3 days earlier, a U.S. reconnaissance team had been ambushed near the area, leading the headquarters of the 26th Marine Regiment to suspect that a large People's Army of Vietnam force was concentrating on the northern hillsides. As Company I advanced through the dense jungle between the two hills, the Marines encountered a deeply entrenched bunker system on the southern slope of Hill 881 North. Machine guns, AK rifles, and anti-tank weapons hidden in camouflaged bunkers opened fire simultaneously. The lead elements were pinned down almost immediately. The Marines hugged the ground, taking cover behind tree trunks and bomb craters while calling for artillery and air support. The fighting continued for several hours. Tactical aircraft repeatedly bombed positions in front of the Marine line, while 105mm artillery from Hill 881 South shelled suspected enemy positions. After each barrage, the Marines advanced again, clearing bunkers and trenches one by one. By the end of the day, they withdrew to Hill 881 South with 7 men killed and dozens wounded. The United States reported that 103 People's Army of Vietnam soldiers had been killed, but this figure was based primarily on bodies found on the battlefield and could not fully reflect the losses suffered by the defending force. Later that day, a People's Army of Vietnam officer surrendered and provided information that a major offensive was imminent. Colonel Lowndes immediately placed the entire base on high alert. Company I was ordered to withdraw completely to Hill 881 South. The artillery batteries were loaded and ready to fire. Marines on the surrounding hills checked their barbed wire, claymore mines, and pre-planned fields of fire. Around midnight on January 2021, Thick fog covered the hills surrounding Khe Sanh. On Hill 861, Company K of the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines, held a small defensive perimeter near the summit. The Marines on the outer positions could see no farther than a few dozen meters. Following a brief artillery bombardment, a battalion of the People's Army of Vietnam suddenly advanced against the southwestern side of the hill. The assault force used satchel charges to breach the wire before overrunning part of the trench line. Marine machine gun positions came under direct attack from RPGs and hand grenades. The battle quickly turned into close-quarters combat. In the darkness and dense fog, small groups of soldiers from both sides exchanged fire along the trenches at distances of only a few meters. Artillery from the Khe Sanh combat base and Hill 881 South was called in to strike the slopes of Hill 861. Some rounds landed so close to the defensive perimeter that the Marines were forced to press themselves into their bunkers as shell fragments swept across the ground outside. Before dawn, Company K launched a counterattack and recaptured the sections of trench that had been overrun. The People's Army of Vietnam force withdrew from the summit, leaving behind 47 bodies, according to U.S. records. At the same time, People's Army of Vietnam artillery began shelling the main base. Mortars, rockets, and heavy artillery fired from positions across the Laotian border and the western hills struck the airstrip, headquarters, and ammunition storage areas. One shell hit the main ammunition dump, triggering a massive explosion. Thousands of artillery rounds, rockets, and explosives stored inside continued to detonate for hours, scattering burning ammunition crates and metal fragments across the base. Thick black smoke engulfed the combat base. Helicopters parked near the runway were damaged. A significant portion of the ammunition stockpile was destroyed on the very first day. Combat engineers and artillery crews raced through a series of secondary explosions to salvage whatever ammunition remained intact from the burning dump. Outside the perimeter, additional artillery rounds continued to fall, making it almost impossible to bring the fires fully under control. The bombardment of January 21 marked the moment when Khe Sanh entered a sustained siege by fire. Route 9 had already been cut in several places, making ground resupply impossible. From that point onward, virtually all food, water, ammunition, and reinforcements had to be delivered by air. At the same time, the wounded and damaged equipment could only be evacuated from the base by aircraft or helicopter. Colonel Lowndes established his command post inside a reinforced bunker near the airstrip. Under his command, the 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, held most of the main base perimeter. The 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines occupied Hills 558 and 861A. The 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines defended Hills 861 and 881 South. The 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, secured the western sector of the base. Artillerymen of the 1st Battalion, 13th Marines, operated the 105mm and 155mm howitzers, while 5 M48 tanks and several recoilless rifles were positioned to provide direct fire against likely avenues of attack. During the days that followed, artillery bombardment became a constant part of life at Khe Sanh. The shelling followed no predictable pattern. At times, the base remained quiet for hours, only to be hit by dozens of incoming rounds within a matter of minutes. People's Army of Vietnam artillery crews frequently changed firing positions, using caves, deep bunkers, and the rugged terrain to conceal their batteries. Some 130mm guns had a greater range than the heavy artillery deployed inside the base, allowing them to fire from positions beyond the direct counter-battery range of the Marines. The Marines spent much of their time digging deeper bunkers. Fresh sandbags were stacked on bunker roofs. Spent artillery shell casings, wooden beams, and metal sheets were salvaged to reinforce defensive positions. After every bombardment, repair teams moved along the trench lines, filling in damaged sections and laying new communication wires to replace those that had been severed. Conditions on the surrounding hills were even more difficult. Hills 881, South 861, and 861A were isolated from the main base and could only be supplied by helicopter. The small landing zones on the hilltops were constantly observed by enemy artillery and machine guns. Each time a helicopter approached, its crew had to dive quickly onto the landing zone, unload ammunition, water, and rations, then lift off before enemy anti-aircraft fire could be adjusted onto the target. As the weather deteriorated, fog and low clouds blanketed the area, often forcing the suspension of helicopter resupply missions. Water became a serious problem on some of the hill positions. The Marines collected rainwater, limited washing, and rationed every canteen of drinking water. Wounded men sometimes had to remain where they were for hours or even overnight because helicopters were unable to reach the landing zones. On January 23, a People's Army of Vietnam force attacked the Laotian military outpost at Khe Sanh, just across the border. The survivors withdrew to Lang Vây, where a U.S. Special Forces camp and Montagnard Civilian Irregular Defense Group personnel guarded Route 9. The fall of Ban Hue Sane further isolated Khe Sanh from the west and signaled that enemy forces were expanding their control over the entire surrounding area. In Washington, President Lyndon B. Johnson closely monitored the situation. Maps of Khe Sanh were brought into the White House. Fears of another Dien Bien Phu quickly emerged among American political leaders and the media. In 1954, French forces had been besieged in a valley while their opponent controlled the surrounding high ground and emplaced artillery in positions once thought inaccessible. At Khe Sanh, the similarities in terrain and the nature of the siege caused every artillery barrage to be viewed as a possible prelude to a full-scale assault. However, the U.S. command believed that Khe Sanh differed from Dien Bien Phu because of its ability to employ overwhelming air power. General Westmoreland gave top priority to Operation Niagara, a fire support system designed to detect and destroy any enemy forces concentrating around the base. Reconnaissance aircraft, electronic sensors, artillery, and air control units worked together to locate targets. Whenever an area was suspected of containing concentrations of People's Army of Vietnam troops, artillery, tactical aircraft, or B-52 bombers would be directed against it. B-52 bombers typically struck in 3 aircraft formations. Dozens of tons of bombs fell across long stretches of jungle, creating continuous chains of explosions along the hillsides. At the base, Marines could feel the ground shaking even though the targets were several kilometers away. Throughout the campaign, the U.S. Air Force flew thousands of sorties and dropped more than 14,000 tons of bombs on the Khe Sanh area. Air power accounted for the majority of the ordnance used against People's Army of Vietnam forces surrounding the base. By January 30, the Tet Offensive had begun across South Vietnam. Cities, provincial capitals, and military installations came under coordinated attack. While fierce fighting erupted in Hue, Saigon, and dozens of other locations, Khe Sanh remained under continuous artillery bombardment. This forced the U.S. command to confront a difficult question. Was Khe Sanh the main objective that had been prepared in advance, or was it merely a diversion designed to draw American forces away from the cities? For the Marines inside the base, however, that question made little difference. They continued to man the trenches, repair damaged fortifications, and wait for a ground assault that could come at any moment. Every night, illumination flares were fired over the approaches to the perimeter. Patrols operated only within a limited distance, usually a few hundred meters beyond the defensive line. Whenever they encountered enemy forces, they were ordered to withdraw so that artillery and air power could engage the target, rather than becoming drawn into a prolonged fight outside the fortifications. Before dawn on February 5th, the People's Army of Vietnam launched an assault on Hill 861A. This was a narrow ridgeline between Hills 861 and 558, defended by Company E, 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines under the command of Captain Earl Breeding. The position had only recently been fortified. In some areas, the defensive wire was only a few dozen meters from the tree line, allowing the attacking force to approach without having to cross a wide stretch of open ground. At approximately 3:05 a.m., 82mm mortar rounds began falling on the hilltop. Moments later, multiple RPG volleys struck Marine machine gun positions and fighting bunkers. Under the cover of this bombardment, People's Army of Vietnam engineer teams advanced to the wire, using satchel charges and obstacle-breaching equipment to create gaps in the defenses. Several assault groups succeeded in penetrating the trench line. Fighting erupted around the machine gun bunkers and the company command post. Some of the Marines' crew-served weapons were knocked out, forcing the remaining defenders to fight with rifles, hand grenades, and machine guns brought in from other sectors of the position. From the main base, the artillery batteries of the 1st Battalion, 13th Marines fired continuously around the slopes of Hill 861A. The gun crews carefully calculated their fire so that the shells would land as close as possible to the defensive perimeter without striking Company E's trench line. On the hill, the Marines who were still able to fight launched a series of local counterattacks, driving the attacking force out of the positions it had overrun. By dawn, the assault had been repulsed. The Marines suffered 7 killed and dozens wounded. U.S. reports recorded 109 People's Army of Vietnam bodies around the position, although no independent Vietnamese figures are available for comparison. The battle demonstrated that the hills surrounding Khe Sanh were more than observation posts. If any one of them were captured, artillery and machine guns could be brought closer to the base, placing the airstrip and the main combat base under direct fire. 2 days later, at 12:42 a.m. on February 7th, the U.S. Special Forces camp at Lang Vei came under attack. Artillery and mortar fire pounded the camp before People's Army of Vietnam infantry advanced alongside PT-76 amphibious tanks. This marked the first time North Vietnamese tanks had been employed in a battle in South Vietnam. The PT-76S broke through the defensive wire and used their main guns to fire directly into the bunkers. Some of the defenders' anti-tank weapons engaged the tanks at close range, but were unable to stop the entire assault force. By approximately 3:10 a.m., Khe Sanh had lost all communication with the camp. Colonel Lowndes was forced to decide whether to send troops from the main base to relieve Lang Vei. A nighttime advance along Route 9 would have required moving through rugged terrain well suited for ambushes. Documents captured later showed that the People's Army of Vietnam had anticipated the possibility of U.S. forces leaving Khe Sanh and had prepared to attack any relief column. Since the enemy force around Lang Vei greatly outnumbered anything Lowndes could commit, the plan to launch a ground rescue operation was abandoned. Later that morning, a small force consisting of 10 U.S. Special Forces personnel and 40 civilian Irregular Defense Group soldiers was airlifted by helicopter to the former camp east of Lang Vei. Supported by jet aircraft and armed helicopters, they succeeded in evacuating a number of survivors, including 15 Americans. 3 helicopters were damaged during the evacuation. On February 8th, approximately 3,000 Laotian soldiers, montagnards, and civilians from Lang Vei moved toward Khe Sanh. Concerned that People's Army of Vietnam troops might have infiltrated the group, Colonel Lowndes refused to admit them into the base immediately. Each person had to be screened outside the perimeter before some were airlifted to safety. Also, before dawn on February 8th, a People's Army of Vietnam battalion attacked a small outpost on Hill 64, about 500 meters from the perimeter held by the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines. Artillery and mortar rounds simultaneously struck the main base to prevent reinforcements from reaching the position. Infantry assaulted from 2 directions, breached the wire, and stormed into the trench system. Machine gun teams were quickly positioned at the breach points, firing to prevent Marines on the eastern side of the hill from reinforcing the western sector. RPGs and satchel charges were used to destroy bunkers one by one. Several sections of the trench line were captured before the defenders organized a counterattack. The battle continued until daylight. Artillery shelled the slopes surrounding the hill while companies from the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines fought to break through to the outpost. By the time the People's Army of Vietnam force withdrew, many of the defensive positions had been destroyed, and casualties among the defenders had risen significantly. The Battle of Hill 64 was one of the few engagements during the siege in which the attacking force penetrated deeply into a U.S. position and held part of its trench system for several hours. Following the battles in early February, large-scale infantry assaults became less frequent, but the artillery bombardment intensified. On some days, hundreds of rounds fell on the base. On February 23, Khe Sanh endured the heaviest bombardment of the entire siege, with U.S. records reporting more than 1,300 artillery shells, rockets, and mortar rounds striking the base. The airstrip came under constant attack. Shell craters repeatedly appeared on the runway and had to be filled by combat engineers as soon as each bombardment ended. C-130 transport aircraft approached at low altitude, touched down only briefly, and took off again as quickly as possible. Every additional minute spent on the ground increased the risk of being hit by artillery or anti-aircraft machine gun fire. When landing became too dangerous, the air crews switched to aerial resupply. Under the conventional parachute delivery system, cargo was dropped from an altitude high enough for the parachutes to deploy. However, strong winds could carry the loads outside the defensive perimeter. Some pallets landed beyond the wire and could not be recovered. To improve accuracy, a low-altitude delivery method was introduced. C-130S flew just above the runway, opened their rear cargo ramps, and used extraction parachutes to pull pallets out while the aircraft continued moving forward. The pallets of ammunition, food, and fuel slid across the ground before coming to rest near the designated collection areas. Ground crews then rushed to pull the supplies into cover before the next artillery barrage began. By March, the base was operating almost entirely through an air bridge. The weather remained unpredictable. Heavy fog forced many aircraft to turn back before reaching Khe Sanh. On the surrounding hills, resupply helicopters adopted group approach tactics, coordinating with armed helicopter escorts, artillery fire, and smoke screens to obscure the defenders from enemy gunners. Despite being surrounded, the defenders did not remain entirely inside their fortifications. Patrols continued to move outside the perimeter to inspect the surrounding area, gather intelligence, and prevent People's Army of Vietnam forces from digging trenches too close to the defensive wire. These patrols, however, were carefully limited in scope. The U.S. command did not want infantry units to move beyond the range of direct supporting fire and risk being ambushed in the jungle. On March 30, a company of the 1st Battalion, 26th Marines advanced southeast of the base and encountered People's Army of Vietnam troops occupying prepared defensive positions. Machine gun and small arms fire pinned down the Marines in open terrain. The unit suffered heavy casualties and was forced to withdraw under the cover of artillery and air support. The engagement demonstrated that the encirclement of Khe Sanh had not yet been broken, even though the intensity of the artillery bombardment had begun to decline. Meanwhile, the U.S. command finalized plans to reopen the route to the base. Operation Pegasus was assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division under Major General John Tolson, working in coordination with Marine Corps and Army of the Republic of Vietnam units. The objective was to advance westward along Route 9, repair the road, establish fire support bases, and use helicopters to insert infantry onto the high ground overlooking the line of advance. On April 1, Operation Pegasus began. Marine battalions advanced westward along Route 9, while combat engineers repaired bridges and filled in damaged sections of the road. Battalions of the 1st Cavalry Division were airlifted by helicopter into landing zones ahead of the ground column. Rather than moving the entire force along the narrow road, U.S. troops systematically seized key high ground, established artillery positions, and then pushed forward by creating new landing zones toward Khe Sanh. On April 3 and 4, cavalry units continued to air assault into areas south of Route 9. Several People's Army of Vietnam defensive positions were identified and struck by artillery before the infantry moved in. Clashes took place on the hillsides and in the forests along the advance corridor, but no continuous defensive line emerged that was capable of stopping the operation as a whole. Before dawn on April 5, the 7th Battalion, 66th Regiment of the 304th Division, attacked Hill 471, which had recently been occupied by the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines. Following an artillery bombardment, the infantry advanced up the slope but was stopped by defensive fire and supporting artillery. The attacking force withdrew after sustaining losses. This was one of the last major attempts to prevent U.S. forces from expanding beyond the Khe Sanh perimeter. On April 6, units of the 1st Cavalry Division reached the vicinity of the base. Patrols from Khe Sanh began making contact with the relieving forces. On April 8, Army of the Republic of Vietnam units repelled a counterattack west of the base. By April 9, most of the besieging forces had withdrawn from their positions immediately surrounding Khe Sanh. On April 11, Route 9 was reopened after combat engineers repaired approximately 14 kilometers of roadway, replaced 9 bridges, and constructed several bypasses. The first vehicle convoys reached the Khe Sanh Plateau, ending the base's complete dependence on aerial resupply. The U.S. command declared that Khe Sanh had been relieved. After 77 days, the defenders had retained control of the main combat base and the surrounding key hill positions. The People's Army of Vietnam never launched the full-scale assault against the entire perimeter that the U.S. command had anticipated. Instead, it relied on artillery bombardment, limited ground assaults, and operations against outlying positions to isolate the base, forcing the United States to concentrate a massive amount of air power, artillery, and mobile forces in the area. At the end of the 77-day siege of Khe Sanh, U.S. forces had retained control of the combat base and the principal defensive hill positions until Operation Pegasus reopened Route 9. According to official U.S. figures for Operation Scotland, American forces suffered 205 killed and 1,668 wounded. When the fighting at Lang Vay, the outlying engagements, and the relieving forces are included, the total casualties of U.S. and Republic of Vietnam forces were considerably higher. The United States estimated that the People's Army of Vietnam suffered between 10,000 and 15,000 casualties, primarily from artillery and airstrikes, but this figure has not been independently verified and remains a subject of debate. From a tactical standpoint, the United States held Khe Sanh, prevented the enemy from capturing the surrounding high ground, and sustained the base through an aerial resupply effort supported by artillery, tactical air power, and B-52 bombers. However, to protect approximately 6,000 troops in the area, the U.S. command had to commit thousands of air sorties, vast quantities of ammunition, and numerous mobile units to a remote battlefield far from the country's major urban centers. For the People's Army of Vietnam, although it failed to capture the base, the campaign succeeded in forcing the United States to concentrate its attention and a substantial portion of its military strength on Khe Sanh at the very moment the Tet Offensive was unfolding across South Vietnam. Only a few months later, U.S. forces demolished the fortifications and abandoned the base, leaving the practical value of the 77-day defense open to continued debate. Khe Sanh therefore remains not only a defensive battle, but also a symbol of the limits of overwhelming firepower in a war where tactical success did not always produce lasting strategic results.